across the country. What are we waiting for? End the shutdown now. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, today marks the 21st day of the government shutdown, an unnecessary and shameful government shutdown. We are now tied with the longest shutdown in American history. A few weeks ago, the President of the United States, President Trump, said he would be proud, quote, proud to shut down the government if he didn't get his way. Mr. President, this is nothing to be proud of. And the harmful impacts of the shutdown are growing by the day, growing on people throughout this country who are being denied important government services, really impacting every American. We just heard the other day from the Food and Drug Administration that they'll no longer be going to be able to carry out some of their food safety inspections, putting at risk the American food supply for every American. We heard from EPA that they're going to be suspending their monitoring of some toxic pollutants, also every day having a growing harmful impact on the country and putting the health of American citizens at risk. So that is nothing to be proud of, Mr. President, nor should any of us be proud of the fact that today marks the first full pay period in this shutdown where federal employees are going to get no pay. These are civil servants who go to work when they're allowed to for the good of our country in all sorts of agencies, providing fundamental services. And today, I know you can't read it from there, they're getting pay stubs, and on the pay stubs in the place where their normal pay period salary should be, there are zeros. Zeros. Now, Mr. President, I just arrived here on the Senate floor from a meeting that Senator Cardin, my fellow senator partner representing the state of Maryland, held in Howard County, Maryland. We met with 16 federal employees, most of whom have been locked out of work and all of whom are not getting any paycheck. And we wanted to bring them together to hear about the impact this shutdown was having on their lives and on their families. But the first thing they really wanted to talk about was that they wanted to get back to work to do the business of the American people. That when they're out of work, so many Americans that rely on their efforts are denied the benefit of their work. So they emphasized the fact that their number one priority was to get back to work on behalf of the American people. But we also want to hear from them directly what the impact was on them as individuals and their families, because they're now getting a big zero on their pay stubs. One of the people we heard from was Frida McDonald. She works at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. She's furloughed right now. She has a chronic medical condition that requires her to get treatments every week. Now, she said she has pretty good insurance to cover most of her health condition, but her insurance doesn't cover the costs of her medication fully, and she needs to get that on a weekly basis. And that on a weekly basis, the co-pays amount to hundreds of dollars. So she is going to be squeezed right away on getting access to the medication to treat her medical condition because she got a pay stub with a big zero on it. We heard from Kerry Woodbridge, Mr. Woodbridge. He works at the Office of Personnel Management. A lot of Americans don't know what that agency does, but they're the agency that has to oversee federal employees throughout the system. And if they're not at work, the whole system begins to break down. And the first thing he emphasized was the total waste of dollars to the American taxpayer in keeping them out of work, because that just creates even more inefficiencies throughout the entire federal government when the Office of Personnel Management can't be on the job. But he also talked about the fact that he's not going to be able to make his mortgage payments. Now, there are a lot of federal employees, thousands and thousands of federal employees, Mr. President, GS-2s, GS-3s. They are literally one payment from not being able to make their bills. And now their pay's not coming in, but I can tell you their bills are still coming in. Their mortgage payments are coming in, their rent payments are coming in, their medical bills are coming in. All those bills, they keep coming in even though their paycheck is not. And Mr. Woodbridge talked about the fact that with the upcoming mortgage payment, he didn't think he'd be able to make it. He's got the electric bills, and he spoke very passionately about his children because he has a son who has some special needs, and in order to make sure that his son can perform well at school, families hired a tutor for that child. And he doesn't think he's going to be able to make the payments to the tutor in the coming weeks. He said, well, the agency said, you know, you should get a lawyer to protect you from the creditors who are coming after you if you can't pay your bills. Mr. Woodbridge had a pretty simple question. If I can't afford to pay my bills, how can I afford to hire a lawyer to protect me from the people who are demanding I pay my bills on time? Eric Bryant, another federal employee there, an Air Force vet, someone who served his country in uniform before serving his country in a civilian capacity in our federal government. And Mr. President, 30% of our federal employees, 30% are veterans. They served their country in the military, and now they're serving their country in a different way as civil servants in the federal government. He said that he had called the electric company to let them know that because he wasn't getting paid, he wasn't sure if he's going to be able to pay his electric bill on time. Could they take it easy on him? The electric company said, we want our money. Sorry, go find the money to pay the bill on time. I don't know if they threatened to turn the lights off or not, but people aren't going to be able to pay their mortgages or their rents or their electric bills or other bills. Now, there was another federal employee who took a moment out of work. He's actually not furloughed. He's working because he's part of the federal law enforcement officers group, and he has been deemed essential for the public safety. But he came there to let us know that when his colleagues, many of them in the analytics part of federal law enforcement, the folks who collect DNA, the folks who are tracking suspects, people who are tracking fugitives, when that whole part of federal law enforcement is furloughed and can't do their job, that puts those who are on the job and in the line of duty at greater risk. He said it puts their lives at greater risk. And of course, to the extent that we are compromising and weakening federal law enforcement in general, we are also putting the public at greater and unnecessary risk every day. And we heard similar accounts from other federal employees who were there. We also heard from a small federal contractor. And Mr. President, I'm sure all of us are hearing, not just from federal employees, but so many small businesses that provide services to the federal government in places around the country. And they are in danger of going belly up in many cases, the small business contractors. And in order to deal with the shutdown and the fact that they may not get paid as a small business by the federal government for their services, they also are laying off their employees. And many of these are low-wage employees or median-wage employees. Think about contractors that provide food services to different government agencies, janitorial services. Those employees are also living paycheck to paycheck, and they've been told not to come into work. And we heard from one's a nonprofit called Senior Service America that actually helps put seniors to work in jobs around the country. And this particular agency, federal contractor in Maryland, just a few days ago laid off 176 of their employees. So these aren't federal employees being laid off. These are, in addition to that, federal contractor employees who work for small businesses that contract with the federal government. So, Mr. President, this is mushrooming. The negative impacts of this are mushrooming by the day, harming families, harming communities, and harming all the others who also require the economic activity from either federal employees or small business contractors to help at their restaurants. And that is on top of what I talked about earlier, which is the negative impact on the denial of important services and health protections for the entire American public. And a lot of the concerns expressed this morning by federal employees also included the long-term impact. So, for example, if you don't make a mortgage payment on time, that's going to hurt your credit rating. In some cases, federal employees who work for national security agencies, their ability to keep their security clearance is tied to their credit rating. So when you start having your credit rating downgraded, it's going to mean, number one, you don't get credit, you can't pay your bills, and it also means in some cases that you risk your entire livelihood, at least in those federal government jobs that require good credit ratings. So none of this is anything that the President of the United States or anybody should be proud of. Now, I do want to say a word, Mr. President, with respect to the contract employees. Yesterday, Senator Cardin, Senator Smith, Senator Brown, Senator Kaine, and many senators, about 30 senators, wrote to the Office of Management and Budget, wrote to the Trump administration, asked them to use their contract authority to hold harmless those federal service contract employees who are being locked out of work through no fault of their own. I was pleased that just yesterday in this body, on a unanimous basis, or by unanimous consent, we passed legislation that would ensure that federal employees were made whole at the end of the day, because they should not be the ones who are punished for a shutdown they had nothing to do with. So Senator Cardin and I and others proposed legislation to ensure that federal employees, innocent federal employees, should not be the victims of a political fight they had nothing to do with. And I'm hopeful that later today that the House of Representatives will pass that legislation and that the President will sign it. Now that, of course, removes a big cloud of uncertainty that hangs over the head of federal employees who are either working without pay or furloughed and locked out without pay. It, of course, doesn't deal with the fact that while federal employees are denied a paycheck, they're not going to be able to make their payments on time on mortgages and rent, and that they will have a snowballing harmful effect from loss of credit rating. It won't address that. There is other legislation that's been introduced by Senator Schatz, myself, and others to make sure that federal employees aren't hurt by because of their credit impact or by people collecting bills, just as we protect servicemen and women who are deployed overseas, to make sure that people can't come after them when they're not here and not able to pay their bills. So I hope, Mr. President, that we will pass that legislation. But all of this just goes to show that while federal employees and these small business service contractors and a growing number of communities that depend on that economic livelihood are being hit by the day, the big losers are also, of course, the American people, both because of the lack of health protections and services, but because at the end of the day, taxpayers want to make sure they're getting services for their tax dollar. And so what are we accomplishing? What are we accomplishing with a government shutdown? And I must say that when the President of the United States says that he can, quote, relate to what's happening, it's pretty clear he can't, right? I mean, I don't know if my colleagues saw the Coast Guard statement the other day and how you're supposed to help make do during the government shutdown. Here's a recommendation that they provide. It's step 4 to supplement your income. They suggest finding supplemental income during your furlough period might be challenging, but here are a few ideas for adding income. Have a garage sale. Have a garage sale. Clean out your attic, basement, and closets at the same time. Sell unwanted larger ticket items through the newspaper or online. Mr. President, give me a break, right? And when the President of the United States says he can relate, I want to see the President of the United States hold a garage sale. This is somebody who, you know, goes from Trump Tower to Mar-a-Lago and then back to the White House. He can't relate to these fellow Americans, federal civil servants, who when they miss a paycheck, they can't pay their mortgage. So this is why just yesterday, Senator Cardin and I asked for unanimous consent for the United States Senate to act immediately on 2 bills that came over from the House to reopen the government. Because, yes, this is the shutdown that President Trump said he would be proud to have if he didn't get his way. He is certainly the initiator. He's certainly the protagonist of the shutdown. But every day that goes by, Mr. President, when this Senate doesn't do what it can and within its power to end the shutdown, the Senate is an accomplice in President Trump's shutdown. If we have it within our power to do our job as a separate branch of government, then we should do it. It's not an excuse not to act because the President doesn't like what we propose. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, we're a separate, independent, and co-equal branch of government. Now, last Thursday, as their very first order of business, the House of Representatives passed 2 bills. The first bill was H.J. Res 1. I got a copy of it right here in my hand. And what this bill does is reopen the Department of Homeland Security at current funding levels through February 8th to give us all an opportunity to debate the best and most effective way to provide border security in our country. The dispute here is not about whether or not we need border security. Of course we need secure borders. I don't want open borders, we need secure borders. The question is, what's the most effective and smart way to accomplish that? And the presiding officer is an expert on this, and I respect the input that he's provided to this body and many others. We need a multi-layered approach. But the purpose of HJ Res 1 was to say, okay, we have some differences over the best way to do that, but let's not shut down the Department of Homeland Security while we debate that. Let's keep it open at least till February 8th at current funding levels and work that out. That's what the House sent to the Senate. And guess what? With respect to the Department of Homeland Security, it's identical, word for word, to what this Senate passed just before Christmas. We passed it on a voice vote, big, overwhelming bipartisan vote. That's what that vote was, right? To keep the Department of Homeland Security Department and other departments open until February 8th. And so, what is the justification, Mr. President, for not having a vote in the Senate on the same thing that we passed by voice vote just a few weeks ago? And the answer we get is, well, the President of the United States doesn't agree with it. Well, too bad. We're a separate branch of government. The President wants to veto that, let him veto it. Then it comes back here. Under the Constitution, we would have a veto override vote. But we shouldn't be contracting out our responsibilities under the Constitution to the President. And yet, the Republican leader, the majority leader, objected to letting us vote again on the same measure that we voted on just before Christmas. And Senator Cardin then offered the other unanimous consent request yesterday. And that was to pass legislation to open up the other 8 of the 9 federal departments that are closed. Departments that have nothing to do with Homeland Security, nothing to do with border security. And this legislation was also passed by the House of Representatives on their opening day, a week ago Thursday. And here's the kicker. The House didn't take the numbers that the House of Representatives was proposing in the appropriation bills for these departments. They took the funding levels the Senate had proposed on a bipartisan basis. And the Senate did that on a bipartisan basis in 2 ways. First of all, this Senate, the full Senate, voted overwhelmingly, certainly by a veto-proof margin, to fund 8 of those 8 federal departments through the remainder of this fiscal year, so September 30th, at levels that we agreed to, first in the Senate Appropriations Committee and then by overwhelming vote here on the Senate floor. And the other measures in the bill the House passed were measures that the Senate Appropriations Committee on a bipartisan basis had overwhelmingly supported. So the House said to the Senate, we're going to send you a bunch of bills to open up the government at levels that the Senate has already agreed on a bipartisan way in one way or another. But the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, on behalf of the caucus, said no. We're not going to allow a vote to reopen those 8 of 9 departments because the President doesn't want to. Because the President wants to hold all those departments that have nothing to do with Homeland Security hostage until he gets his wall, 2,000-mile-long wall. The irony, of course, Mr. President, you know this because the President's own budget for this year was $1.6 billion. That was the President's budget for this year. Now, I am happy to sit down, and I know all our colleagues are, and work out the best way to provide border security. We've had barriers along parts of our border long before President Trump was in office, part of an overall approach. But we don't want to be wasting taxpayer dollars. As I said, even the President's budget for this year wasn't requesting what the President now says he needs. And let's be straight with the American people. It's not just a $5.7 billion or whatever it is. To build a wall, you're talking about a 2,000-mile wall, $30 billion. So what the president wants to do is come back every year and shut down the government until he gets his next installment on a 2,000-mile long wall. That the experts tell us is not the smartest way to provide border security, and certainly not in the most cost-effective way. And let us remember again, the president said this was something Mexico was going to have to pay for, not the American taxpayer. I saw him on TV down at the border yesterday trying to explain away that campaign promise. Oh, I didn't really mean they were going to pay for it directly. It's going to be indirect. That's just not happening. We know Mexico's not paying for this wall like the president said. And so that's why it's important for the Senate, as its first order of business, to pass the legislation that's before us that we've already supported on a bipartisan basis. We literally have the keys today, if we wanted to pass the bills to reopen the government. Send them to the president. Doesn't want to sign them? At least we've done our work as a Senate, and we would then face the question of overriding the president's veto to open the government. So this is where we are now, and as I said, we have, as each day goes by, Americans being denied more and more services. In addition to the ones I've already mentioned, I've spoken to a lot of small businesses who rely on the Small Business Administration for their small loans to get up and running. A lot of folks in farm country who really rely on farm service credit and farm center services. They're being squeezed very, very badly. So this is impacting people throughout the country. You know, 80% of federal employees actually live and work outside of the national capital area. 80% of them are folks like the folks along the border. TSA officials all over the country at airports. All of them are being asked to come to work every day without pay. They're getting a zero on their pay stub like the other hundreds of thousands of federal employees. So it seems to me, Mr. President, that this is the time for us to act. And that's why I've joined with so many of my colleagues to just say to the Republican leader, to the majority leader, let's do our job under the Constitution. Yes, we know what the president's position is, but what's our position? And why are we unwilling to vote on two bills that are before us that reflect the position that this Senate has taken on a bipartisan basis already? How can we justify to our constituents and people around the country that we're unwilling to take a vote on measures that we know have overwhelming support here in the United States Senate because we want to somehow reinforce the president on his own political fight? So I am very hopeful that as the days go by, the Republican leader here will decide to make sure this body, the United States Senate, does its job as a separate branch of government and take up the bills that will reopen the federal government, put people back to work for the American people, make sure that federal employees who are working get paid and those who have been furloughed have a chance to come back to work on behalf of the American people. We have it within our power to do it today. We have it within our power to do it any day now. And I hope we will do our part to end this shameful shutdown. Tomorrow it will be the longest shutdown in American history. And the President of the United States may say he's proud of it. But I hope not a single senator, Republican or Democrat in this body, is proud of being here in the day of history when we broke the record for the longest government shutdown. Because in my view, that's a dereliction of duty, and it's certainly a dereliction of duty not for us not to do our part and to use the power we have to take a vote on the bills that are at the desk in the United States Senate to reopen the government for the American people. And I see that my friend, the senator from Maine, is now on the floor, and I want to thank him for his leadership in this battle. And let's do the right thing, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I first want to make a simple declarative sentence. There is no one in this body who is for open borders. One of the most troublesome aspects of this debate, as it has been framed particularly by the administration, is that you're either for the wall or open borders. That is not true. Virtually every member, well, 2/3 of us voted in 2013 for a very strong border security provision as part of the comprehensive immigration reform bill that passed this body, as I say, by 2/3. It was never taken up in the House. Had it been taken up in the House, it likely would have passed, the President would have signed it, and a lot of these issues would be behind us. All of us, everyone here on both sides of the aisle, support border security. What we support is cost-effective, effective, sensible border security, not border security that really doesn't fit the nature of the problem that we face, and so far anyway is undefined in terms of location, design, cost, and all the other characteristics of any major construction project submitted to this Congress for its approval. I don't believe a wall, and again, one of the problems with this whole discussion is, what does the President mean when he says wall? Is it 30 feet high? Is it 20 feet high? Is it steel? Is it concrete? This has evolved over time. But the biggest question is where and how long? Is he talking about a wall that extends from the Gulf of Mexico to Southern California to the Pacific Ocean? That's about 2,000 miles. Is that what he's talking about? If so, we should know that. And then we can debate it as it relates to other potential options for securing the border along that distance. Now, it also should be noted that there already is wall, by anybody's definition, along portions of that border. I've seen them. I've been to McAllen, Texas, where the President was yesterday, and I've seen the wall, a wall. But the question is, how big is it? Where is it going to go? And how is it going to be designed and paid for? Now, one of the reasons the wall is really not the right solution for the current problems of immigration starts with the fact that about 50% of the illegal immigrants, of the undocumented immigrants in this country today, are here on legal visas that they've overstayed. So a wall has nothing to do with these people. These are people that came in at airports and all other ports of entry into the United States all over the country. 50% are here on overstaying visas. The wall has zero effect on that issue. The other principal issue that we're facing at the wall, and this has also been confused in the coverage and the caravans and the news and the fear that has been spread, the vast majority of the people coming to the border today are not looking to sneak across. They're looking for a port of entry to give themselves up as asylum seekers. They are not illegal immigrants. They are availing themselves of American law that once they get to this country with a credible fear of prosecution or persecution or danger in their home country, they have a right to be determined whether they are legitimate asylum seekers, and that's who we're dealing with. That's who all these people are, who you see the pictures, the caravan. They weren't headed for a blank place in the Arizona desert. They want to go. They want to be captured. They want to be taken into custody, and then they can have their asylum claim adjudicated. So the wall has nothing to do with them. And the wall is a response to a problem that's decades old, that has grossly, drastically diminished over the last 10 or 15 years. The problem of people literally sneaking across the border, entering the country illegally. All of the data is that that number is down. It's down about 85% from the number of people that entered the country illegally in 2007. Over the past 10 or 11 years, and by the way, all the data can be found in a fascinating document produced in September of 2017, about a year ago, by the Trump administration Department of Homeland Security. And I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like Status of Illegal Immigration at the Southern Border. It's a long report full of graphs. And I like graphs, but I don't need to hold them up because all of the graphs have a downward slope in terms of illegal entries, people that get away, the number of people that are coming in that are recidivists who've been here before, they're all down. So to argue that somehow we're in a crisis today when all the indicators are moving in the right direction is really hard to reconcile with the reality. So the issue that I'm trying to illustrate is the wall is the wrong solution to the current problem. It may have been a rational solution in 1985 or even in 2005 or in 2006 when the Congress passed a major fence law and did increase border security substantially. But today we're dealing with a different set of problems that the wall, whatever it is, doesn't address. So, I said at the beginning, nobody here is against border security, and there may be places where a wall is part of that. But one of the secondary problems that we have is we've never been told what this thing, the wall, is. How long it will be, how big it will be, how much it will cost, whether it's going to be on private land or federal land. We don't have the plans, a plan, for what it is that's actually being proposed that the government is being held hostage over. We don't know what the president wants. To say, I want a wall, doesn't tell you much. Is it 2,000 miles long or 100 miles long? Is it 20 feet high? Is it a fence? Or is it a 30-foot high concrete wall or something with steel slats, which seems to be the design of the day? We don't really know what it is. If the mayor of Bangor, Maine, went to the city council and said, I want to build a new school, but I'm not going to tell you how many students are going to be in it, I'm not going to tell you where we're going to build it, and I'm not going to tell you what it's going to cost, but just give me a blank check to build that school. The city council of Bangor would laugh her honor out of the hall. It wouldn't even think about doing something. No city in America would do something like that, and yet that's what we're being asked here today. We're being asked essentially for a blank check. Well, it's a check of $5.7 billion, but that's a down payment. The real estimates for what they think the president wants is more in the $20 to $25 billion amount. And that gets me to my final point before I talk about the impact of this in Maine. Let's say we could settle this week. We could negotiate with the White House, which is not easy to do because their position changes day to day. But let's say we could negotiate and say, okay, it's going to be 100 miles of wall, and here's what this will be the size, this will be the design, this is the agreed upon cost. Let's say that we could do that. If we do that in the context of the government being shut down, we're inviting this to happen again. Next year, we'll have more budgets. We've got a debt ceiling debate coming that's very important for the future of the country, for the economics of the country, for the soundness of our economy, and we've got budgets coming next September. If this works, if this shutdown that's been initiated by the president works as a tactic to get a portion of his wall, he'll do it next time. That's why the age-old principle is you don't negotiate with hostage takers. Why? Because if you do, the next time they'll do it again. And this will become a normal and routine tactic between this president and perhaps future presidents and the Congress that puts us in a position of being totally we have to choose between a government shutdown and the pet project of whoever that president is. That's a very dangerous path for us as a deliberative body, and particularly as a co-equal branch of the United States government. So, I've talked in sort of global terms, but this is hurting Main Street America. And we've heard today, and we've heard on the news, and we hear all the time about the effects on the furloughed federal workers, which are very real. Today's the day they don't get their check. And here's the problem. You can shut down and stop people's checks from coming, but you can't stop their bills from coming. Their mortgage payment, their child care payment, their automobile insurance, their home insurance, their heating bill, their medication, their food, all of that has to be paid for, and we can say, well, they'll make adjustments. Well, that's a pretty hard path to put people on. That's a heartless path. And these people are being used as pawns, as hostages, in a policy debate that has nothing to do with them. One of the easiest solutions, Mr. President, would be for us to pass the 6 bills that the House has passed, that we passed, that fund 90% of the government. Why should the Department of Agriculture be caught in the crossfire of a debate over a wall in Texas? Why should park rangers be caught in that? Why should Coast Guard people be caught in that? And this is having a real effect. And aside from those federal workers, of whom there are about 1,000 in Maine on furlough right now, they're all the contractors that serve these government agencies. And we passed a bill last night that's going to ensure that the furloughed federal employees will eventually be paid. That doesn't say anything about what they're going to have to do about penalties on late mortgages and those kinds of things that they can't pay now. But there's no help for the contractors that are going to lose total income during this period, and some of them will be threatened of going out of business. So it's not just the 800,000 workers nationwide, it's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people who depend on those agencies for the work that they do, that they provide to the federal government. But let's talk about effects in hometown, in Main Street America. In just places all over Maine. In Portland, for example, I chuckle because it sounds like, oh, this is no big deal. One of our most growing industries in Maine is beer. And we now have over 1,000 people employed in the craft brewing industry. It's been a growth industry. And yet they're being stymied, the brewers are being stymied, many of them, because they can't ship their beer across state lines without approval from the Food and Drug Administration of their labels, and that's held up. And we've got a merger or an expansion of a brewery in southern Maine that's held up because they can't get their permission from the Tax and Trade Bureau, from the ATF. So these are the kinds of things, the services that are being provided that aren't being occurred. The Portland Press-Herald reported on the breweries. The Portland Press-Herald also reported on a developer that has a project to develop a real estate project in Maine, can't get an SBA loan. SBA's shut down, and that's going to hold it up and could even cause the deal to fall through. The Bangor Daily News reports a family that's stuck in the middle where they've moved out of their house anticipating a closing on a new house with a Agriculture Department loan guarantee that's now stuck, stranded, no action, nobody to answer the phone, and they're living out of boxes. they're caught in the middle. These are people, these aren't federal employees, these are good Maine people who relied upon the daily activities of the federal government occurring, which ought to be just simple common sense, and yet they're caught without a place to live. The Ellsworth American, a newspaper in Ellsworth, Maine, a award-winning weekly newspaper, reports about a smokehouse that does smoked salmon. And they were getting ready to reopen, hire people, they got people on staff, and all of a sudden, they're dead stop because of the Food and Drug Administration can't act to approve their licenses. Now, you can say, okay, this little smokehouse can survive, the family will find a place to live, they can live. But if you multiply these examples by thousands and millions, you're talking about a really substantial effect on real people's lives. And there's no excuse for it. If this were over some major life or death policy issue, it would be somewhat understandable, but this is an eminently negotiable problem, not a crisis, but a problem. I don't argue that it's not a problem and that the southern border doesn't need to be secure. Again, I swear that's where I started. But the question is, how do you do it right? How do you do it in a way that makes sense to the American taxpayer? There may be places where it's wall, but the wall is $20 million a mile. There may be ways to do it for a fraction of that and provide equal security. There also are ways, for example, with better screening devices at the ports of entry to deal with drugs. And by the way, all of the data from the DEA, the current administration drug enforcement agency, is that the principal source of drugs coming across the southern border is at ports of entry, hidden in cars, hidden in trucks, not over, through, and around someplace in the middle of the desert. That's where the drugs are coming through. That's where we ought to be concentrating. That's where we ought to be putting the technology, more dogs or more technology that can detect this kind of thing. Not building a wall that doesn't address the current problem. It's a solution, but it's going after the wrong problem. So, these are real life impacts. It doesn't need to be this way. If this were a project being proposed by the military, a new BOQ at Fort Benning, it would come to this Congress. It would go to the Authorization Committee. The plans would go to the Appropriations Committee. We would review it, question the sponsors, determine if it was an appropriate expenditure of public funds, and either approve it or deny it or suggest some alteration. This wall has never gone through that process. And we are basically abdicating to the administration a major decision, particularly about public expenditure, without meeting our responsibilities. Now, one really simple way to get out of this would be for us to vote by 2/3 to pass the budget that we voted like 98-2 several weeks ago, has $1.6 billion in it for border security, by the way. Pass that, and then sit down and talk to the administration about just what it is that you want and what's reasonable and how do we do it in a sensible way, and then we can get this thing done. What worries me is the posture that the Senate is in today is adding a provision that isn't in the Constitution. The Constitution says the president can veto a bill. What we're saying here now through our inability or unwillingness to bring a bill to the floor is the president can stop a bill simply by saying he doesn't like it. That's not what the Constitution says. It doesn't say the president has the right to stop bills he doesn't like. It says he has to veto it. If he's going to veto it, fine. Then we can discuss it and debate it and determine whether that's an appropriate veto. But by avoiding the responsibility of considering this legislation, we're essentially handing the president a massive power that presidents, I don't believe, should have. This is an important issue. It's one that should be considered. It's one that should be debated. I'd like to see the administration given the opportunity to make its case for the specifics, not the case generally about criminals or drugs, which many of those claims have been refuted, but a specific case about here's what we want to do, here's the effect of it, here's what it'll cost, and here's why this is the best solution, as opposed to other solutions like a fence or more Border Patrol agents or more technology, a drone or sensors or whatever. But we're not being given that opportunity. I'm perfectly willing to debate that in good faith. I don't dismiss out of hand that a wall may make sense in certain areas, but I'm not prepared to give this administration a blank check for some construction project that I don't know what it is they want to build. I'm also very reluctant to concede anything in the context of a hostage situation, where the United States government is being held hostage because of a project that the president wants to build. If we do this, Mr. President, this will become the go-to tactic for this administration and probably for future administrations. We will have established a precedent that will haunt this institution for years to come. And that's one of the reasons I think it's just imperative that we not cave into this kind of attempted intimidation and express our good faith willingness to look at, work on, and try to establish the right role for all parts of border security, but not put all of our chips in one area that I believe will be both ineffective, not cost-effective, and damaging to our other efforts to actually secure the border and protect the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I listened to some of the remarks from my colleague from Maine. I appreciate so much of what he has said, the reminder to us all to be acting in good faith here. And I'd like to just take a few moments this morning to just say, count me in. Count me in to be operating in good faith. Count me in as one of the many in this body and the many around this country who want to ensure that we have strong borders in this nation, that we have true and meaningful border security, whether it's at our southern border or whether it's at our northern borders, whether it's our borders on land or whether it is our borders on sea. Count me in as one who is prepared to deal with the difficulties, the true humanitarian issues that we are seeing on the southern border today, with an influx of children and families, those who are seeking asylum, those who are frustrated with our systems. Count me in as one of those who wants to address these issues. But also count me in as one who says that shutting down the government is not governing. Nobody is winning in this. And I've been reading all the accounts that are out there in terms of whether people think that this is on the president, whether this is on the Democrats, whether this is on the House. You know who it's on, Mr. President? It is on the backs of all of us, of the men and women who are the federal workers, who work hard, who get up every day doing the job that we've tasked them to do, some of whom are furloughed, some of whom are working without pay, but all of whom are worried about where we are. We're now the longest shutdown that we have seen. I think it's either today or tomorrow that we pass that benchmark there. And it's not just those that are federal workers that are being impacted. It is those of us who rely on the services of those who work in our agencies. I come from a state, as does my colleague from Maine, where fisheries are a significant issue for us. Well, NOAA, NIMS, some of these other agencies have a great deal to do with the economic health and well-being of our state right now. This is our big crabbing season. This is the time of year where there's a lot of folks out there on the water that need to be able to provide for their families, their livelihood. And you think it's all about looking for the crab at the bottom of the Bering Sea. Well, in order to do that, you not only have to have certain permits, you have to have the ability to unload your load at the dock with certified scales. Not necessarily in the crab fisheries, but in other fisheries, you have to have observers on your boats. Well, one of the things that we're learning is the observers need to be checked out after their trip. They have to be checked out before they can move to another vessel. Well, you've got kind of a ripple effect that is going on out there. So whether you are a cod fisherman or a crab fisherman, and you're thinking, government shutdown doesn't mean anything to me, it does until it doesn't, or it doesn't until it does. Our reality is that there is impact, and I understand that it impacts us in many, many different ways. Every morning I check in with the folks that are answering my phones here in Washington, D.C., along with staff back in Alaska, and I'm saying, what are we hearing from folks back home? And I'll tell you, I've got a lot of people that are saying, Lisa, you got to stand with the president. You got to stand strong on this because we need to have border security. And then I have an equal number that are saying, please, please do something to help reopen this government. We expect it of you. We need it from you. We are begging you to make things work. Fix it back there. And so I think about where we are right here and right now. And there have been some suggestions out there that we don't know how long this is going to take, but we just got to hunker down, and you're just going to have to figure out how you can make ends meet. And we've got some great credit unions in the state of Alaska that have put out notices that have said, hey, you're concerned about how you're going to make that mortgage, make that car payment, pay your landlord, come to us and talk to us. And I so appreciate that. But I also know that many times that is limited in its application. And so this suggestion that I've heard by some that, well, you can just go out there and get a second job. I come from the state where we've got the highest unemployment rate in the country right now, or maybe we're now just second from the bottom. But you're in communities where you don't have a lot of options. Our Coast Guard base in Kodiak is the pride and joy for the Coast Guard. We've got a lot of coasties that service us in Alaska, about 2,500, and that's significant for us. But in the community of Kodiak, if the military spouse, if the Coast Guard spouse says, I've got to go find a job because my husband isn't getting paid and we're not quite sure when it's going to come, in Kodiak it's pretty dang tough to go find a temporary job. One of the things that we've learned is that got a situation, okay, Coast Guard are required to be showing up, and we so appreciate that. We so appreciate the work of the Coast Guard. They're out there in the Bering Sea right now. They're helping those that are dealing with some pretty extreme conditions, and every day they're putting their life on the lines for us. And so the fact that they are not protected at this point in time causes me great concern and anxiety and stress, as it does them as well. But think about it. You've got a situation where your non-exempted employees are those that are providing childcare at the child care center. So you still are going to work, but you're not getting paid, but your child care center is now not open. Think about these real life implications, applications. And then think about the very easy answer. Well, go out and find something to tide you through. And so I asked my team back here, I was like, well, wait a minute. You could go out and you could drive Uber. Well, if you're a federal employee, you can have secondary employment. But in order to ensure that there's no conflict with your federal job, you have to get permission to do so. So if you're in the middle of a shutdown, where do you go? And it's your department that's shut down. Where do you go for permission to get that secondary job? Where do you go for permission to say, hey, I want to drive Uber for the next however many weeks until the government is now open? There's nobody there to give the approval. So it's things like this where we can say back here in the halls of Congress, just hang tough, just be strong, just talk to your landlords. We're all going to get through this together. We want border security. I want border security. I think that the president's request for a comprehensive view of how we address this is not something so unreasonable. Let's figure that out. Let's walk through it. I was part of a group this week that was suggesting let's take that proposal that the acting OMB director sent to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. Let's treat that as a request for supplemental appropriations. Let's have that hearing. But in order to do this, we've got to get our colleagues on the other side to sit down and go through this process with us. So maybe we can get a short-term reprieve. Let's do a short-term CR to allow us to process this. But let's not keep the government shut down while we do this. We can figure these things out. Everyone's talking about leverage. It's all political leverage. Well, tell that to the people who are really worried right now. We had a pretty tough earthquake November 30th that a lot of folks are still digging out of, that are writing checks to contractors because they need to make sure that they're going to have a boiler to get through a cold winter, or make sure that the foundation in the home that they want to get back into, that they're going to be able to get back into it sooner than later. But what do you do if you're not sure if that paycheck that was supposed to come today is coming today or coming 2 weeks from now? And you've written the check to the contractor. There's a lot of anxiety out there. And so I hear from them, a lot of these folks that are dealing with unexpected household expenditures after that earthquake, and I shouldn't say it's just after that earthquake. We just had another one yesterday, 4.2, I'm told. 4.7 yesterday. This is the fourth earthquake that we've had since the first of this year, January 1st, that has exceeded 4.0. So we had the big one, and then we've had thousands afterwards. So we're still dealing with a lot of this stuff. And so when people hear that the request for FEMA assistance or for small business assistance may be delayed because the government's not open, think about how we're compounding their stress, their anxiety. So I have been part of groups that have talked to the vice president, has talked to his negotiating team. I've raised these issues myself with the president. I want to be part of this solution, and I want to be part of this solution sooner than later, because we owe it to the people of this country to function. And when the government is shut down, partial or otherwise, we're not functioning. So let's stop talking about who has leverage and who doesn't have leverage, and when that's going to tip to advantage the other side. Let's do what we need to do when it comes to ensuring the security of our nation and our borders. Let's navigate those issues, but let's not hold hostage good men and women who are working hard to keep us safe every day through the basic functions of government. I'm one who has signed on, I think, to most of the bills that are out there that would help alleviate some of what individuals and their families are seeing, whether it's Pay Our Coast Guard Act, the End the Government Shutdown Act, the Pay Accepted Personnel Act. But you know what? Those are simply Band-Aids, and quite honestly, they're probably nothing more than messages right now. But what I'm hearing from folks is keep us secure, protect our borders, deal with humanitarian issues, but allow our government to function. Go to work, stop arguing about who's winning, and let's get the government open.